here's a question. Is the nation being stalked by 70 million sociopaths? I believe our next guest thinks so, but we'll find out. Bruce Cannon Gibney is a writer. He is also a venture capitalist. He's worked at a hedge fund, been a partner at one of the Silicon Valley's top venture capital firms, the Founders Fund, and he is the author of a new book entitled A Generation of Sociopaths, How the Baby Boomers Destroyed America. So, Bruce, first of all, thanks for coming on the show and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start with this, I guess. First of all, just to get this out of the way, I am a baby boomer, but I'm not offended by the premise, nor do I take it personally. I wouldn't describe myself as convinced, but let's start with this. What's the thumbnail sketch of your book? What are you really saying here?
Sure. So the genesis of the book is I thought something had gone wrong with the United States over the past 20, 25 years on a variety of metrics. So it seemed like the pace of social progress had slowed. It hadn't stopped, but it had slowed, certainly compared to the revolutions we saw between, let's say, 1945 and 1965. Obviously, economic growth has come down. Inequality has risen. There are a number of substantial challenges, anything from climate to research and development to even sort of increasingly unsafe infrastructure, which have become real problems, which weren't problems before. and they didn't seem like they were being addressed. So I wondered what had gone wrong. And it seemed that the arrival of baby boomer political power, which really began taking hold in the late 1970s, but was institutionalized when Clinton and Gingrich ascended to office in the first half of the 1990s. It seemed that things started to go wrong roughly around then. Now, there was a lag, of course, because policies had to take time to have an effect. So you'd expect that sort of hysteresis to show up in the late 90s, and that's sort of what we saw. We saw, the beginnings of long-term fiscal imbalances, a real neglect of investment, and declining rates of social progress. And as I sort of traced the policies back, it did seem that they tended to benefit one group overwhelmingly, and that group had the political power to realize its wishes, and that was the baby boomers. And I should emphasize that, I don't attribute the sociopathic label to all baby boomers. I make this point early in the book, but I do think that at least every 2 years, a plurality of the boomers do seem to vote for policies that can be described as antisocial. And antisocial personality disorder is the contemporary name for sociopathy.
And yet, okay, let me go back a couple steps there with you. Because here was my take. I did a little research. I read most of the book. I did a little digging into you. You have a record as a reasonable guy, in my opinion. Certainly for the Silicon Valley. You didn't drink the libertarian Kool-Aid there and so on. This reads to me, I have to be honest with you, Bruce, it reads to me more like a book pitch that got picked up and then the book was retrofitted to the argument. It doesn't feel real to me. It doesn't feel that the cohort you describe, you're lumping together an extremely heterogeneous group of people into one basket of deplorables, if you will, in order to make an argument that to me doesn't seem to really fit or cohere. To even say, for example, that Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich and Donald Trump and the hippies of the late 1960s and so on, not to mention African Americans, Hispanics, poor people, whatever, that this is somehow a coherent group acting in its own interest, to me feels like saying, well, every Sagittarius is voting in the interest of other Sagittariuses. I don't think, it doesn't feel like, I feel like you're backing into this and almost apologizing at certain points in the book for doing so.
Well, so having read the book, you know that I specifically exclude the minority experience from my definition of boomers because it's so radically different. And I focus mainly on the cultural conditions and the economic conditions that produced a set of behaviors. And so for that reason, I focus on the white middle class who were raised in fairly homogenous ways, who had fairly similar sort of economic experiences early on, with the exception perhaps of the very last year's boom. So their upbringings were pretty conformist. They had the same set of very powerful and limited influences. It's a much more homogenous generation than the millennials, back when the baby boomers seem to feel free to make any number of assertions, right? So it's 78% white as opposed to, about 60% white. Exclude the immigrant experience. So I'm focused on the sort of the very large, fairly homogenous cohort of white middle class boomers. So I do think that you can identify through cultural characteristics a set of people in a way that you can't for people who are, say, Sagittarii, as you alluded to. So the other thing that I think is important to note is that with respect to policy, it is actually possible for a diverse group, a group that has ideological divides on certain cultural issues. This is a very profound ideological divide. But with respect to important matters to policy and matters of policy which determine the national budget and therefore the national future, there is an enormous generational unity, and that's most specifically manifest in the case of old age benefits, so Social Security and Medicare. And in a slightly weaker way, it's manifest in other items of long-term investment like research and development, infrastructure, and climate, where the cost of remediation has to be borne by those presently living, but the rewards will be reaped by people who are going to be living past the 2030s. And that doesn't include the boomers. Some boomers will live in the 2040s, hopefully a little longer in the case of my parents. We'll find out. So with respect to those items, because they have expiration dates that are roughly coterminous with boomers, it is possible for the boomers to have a great deal of generational unity. And so even with respect to your point about ideological divides, take the more contemporary Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who would appear to be completely different. The one item on which they agreed in 2016 was preserving the entitlement system as is, even though the Social Security and Medicare trustees, by their own admission, and I think they're a very candid group, have stated that the system cannot be maintained as is past 2034 in the case of Social Security and a little bit earlier in the case of Medicare. So
what they've stated, actually, Bruce, is that without a change to financing, that benefits would be paid out at approximately 75% of their current rate unless some change is made in terms of paying into the system. Are you familiar with an economist named L. Josh Bivens by any chance?
I am not, but your description of it is correct, right? So this Republican talking point that Social Security is bankrupt or about to go bankrupt or a Ponzi scheme, that's just not true. What's going to happen is Social Security will, as you mentioned, become partially insolvent. So under the law, it can only pay out what it collects. And by 2034, that will be somewhere between 16 and 27% lower than the scheduled benefits, than the promised benefits. So, and Medicare faces a similar dynamic, but it doesn't have the same sort of trust fund that Social Security has. It does have a trust fund. It's much smaller and it derives much more heavily from general revenues. But what we're really looking at is, a breach of an implicit promise between the government and multiple generations. And the boomers, are going to collect at more or less the scheduled benefit rates, and younger people simply won't be able to do that. And we've already seen what this looks like in the case of pensions, right? So, the Central States Pension Fund is going to run out of money soon, and there's been an enormous amount of litigation to prevent them from reducing their payout rates, even though it's known by the trustees of that fund, and they've argued for a reduction in benefits, that what will happen is the mandatory contributions by younger people will simply flow out to older people, and there will be nothing left.
See, I just interrupt you for a second. I think where we differ, well, first of all, I think the sociopath framing is, while it's attention getting, I think is perhaps a little overheated. But I think you miss the fundamental driver of what's really changed in the last 30 to 40 years. In fact, since around 1970 or so, which is that's when overall productivity growth ceased to be shared equally among all segments of the population, and inequality began to grow. Now, you do address inequality in your book, and I give you credit for that, but the notion that we have instead a runaway era of inequality, so that, for example, the reason why I mentioned the economist Bivens is because with more of the system was designed so that 90% of America's income would be paid into the Social Security Trust Fund. Now something closer to 80% is being paid in because so much more income is going to the very top, which is not being taxed for Social Security payroll tax and Medicare payroll tax. So I think you reverse the driver, the cause, and the effect. So the reason why Social Security has a long-term issue is because more of the national income needs to be taxed. That's my interpretation of the situation. And overall, if we have sociopaths in our country, it's people who are accumulating vast amounts of wealth without paying back to the society in a reasonable fashion.
So I'm going to push back partially on that,
Sure.
although I agree with you in part. At the end of the book, I argue for lifting the cap on income, which I think this year is 127.5, and amounts over that aren't subject to Social Security payroll tax. So I think from a policy perspective, you and I are aligned on this.
Yes.
You raised a number of other points regarding, income inequality and productivity. So income inequality. Let's start with productivity. So my argument about productivity, which I make in chapters, 5 and 15 and a couple other places, is that research and development, which is the fundamental so technological progress is the fundamental driver of productivity growth in advanced economies, right? We don't need to create any more capital markets. The capital markets are more than sufficiently developed. But we do need to find ways to make the economy more productive. Now, we are running into certain limits. Services businesses are harder to make more productive than manufacturing businesses. And in fact, the increased productivity of American manufacturing is one of the reasons why there's been job displacement. But in order to make everything more productive overall, and it's not that services businesses can't be made more productive, right? For example, automated drivers, right? Driverless cars can make long distance trucking more productive, although we have to figure out how we're going to appropriately retrain people whose jobs are displaced, which is an issue that people in the boomer political class haven't done with well. And you can go back to NAFTA, for example. We understood that NAFTA was going to create displacement. That was negotiated by Bush 1 and pushed by Clinton, signed by Clinton, and it's proceeded on Republicans, both Democrat and Republican. No one did anything about job retraining. So there was no concerted push as there was, for example, after World War II with the GI Bill and with vocational training.
Oh, I completely agree. Yeah, no, I think that part's exactly right. I mean, my analysis of why is somewhat different than yours. The interesting thing, and unfortunately, Bruce, we're going to run out of time. Maybe we can do it again sometime. But it's true. You and I generally do agree on the policy solutions. I think the analysis is a little more. I give you credit; it's attention getting. I think the prescription. While we may differ on diagnosis, I think we generally agree on the prescriptions and on the solutions. So I guess, I'll give you the last word here, but I'm going to say that my big concern is that by demonizing baby boomers, for whether it's for not saving, when 51% of households say that they don't have $400 to spend in case of an emergency, or for policies that really weren't directed by baby boomers per se, but by a small cohort of wealthy and politically influential people. I think that's maybe missing the point. But prescription-wise, I would say we do agree. So we got about 30 seconds. I'm going to give you the close.
listen, to the extent that there's a coterie of powerful people controlling society, this is still at some level democracy. Someone had to keep voting for these policies. Someone had to vote for Clinton's version of neoliberalism, right? Someone had to vote for Bush. Someone had to vote for Trump. The boomers tended to vote for these people more aggressively than younger people, and they tended to benefit from the policies to a greater degree than younger people. So the idea, it would be nice if we didn't have to ascribe blame to anything, but so long as we presume that we have something approximating democracy, no one putting a gun to anyone's head in the voting booth, people have to take responsibilities for the policies enacted by their designated representatives. And in fact, actually, the increase in direct democracy, both through referenda and through these pseudo contracts, especially pushed by the right, strongly suggests to me that people are translating their political will directly to their representatives. So convenient as it may be to blame everything on Washington, and that's just a different version of blame. So long as we believe that, society is at least partly democratic, you really have to ascribe blame to the plurality of the voters.
Well, okay, we're going to have you back if you feel like it, because we could discuss that one all day, too. But listen, it's a provocative and interesting book, Bruce Cannon Gibney. The book is A Generation of Sociopaths, and as a baby boomer, I've got to go out now and kill a dog or something, I guess. But listen, Bruce, thanks for coming on the show. If you feel like it, we'd love to have you back sometime.
It'd be my pleasure. Thank you.